to report on. I mean, there's a ton in the news right now between Facebook dying, taking its last gasps as stockholders jump ship and Zuck loses, I think it was $16.8 billion in minutes, all mostly because of censorship and not actually having freedom of speech. Then there's talk around 11 GOP members moving to impeach Rosenstein, which I did a video on not too long ago. But the story that I'm reporting on in this video is all of the news surrounding the trade war, especially following the summit with Putin, where Putin called out Bill Browder, who I discussed in a previous video, and Trump dared to question the legitimacy of our intel agencies, which fully deserve to be questioned. It's just that the exclusion of calling Russia out for lying in the past and pushing their own agenda and pushing their own interests was a point of contention and controversy. And Trump did discuss election interference with Putin, despite the media claiming that he didn't. The story today, though, is that Trump met with the EU Commission president, and they complain that they never know which Trump they're going to get, and fair enough, because he's not consistent in his speech all of the time, but his actions and his policies are highly consistent. Just because they can't see the way that he's playing them is kind of proof that what he's doing is actually working. And I'm not trying to sit here and pretend that I know everything that Trump is doing and why he's doing it, but I do know that the EU is globalist and far left and filled with career politicians. They don't know anything different from that little bubble that they're in. They're not used to a deal maker. They're used to someone who just toes the globalist line and goes along with their suicidal policies. When Trump doesn't do that, but then acts friendly towards them or seems like he wants to negotiate, they're completely thrown for a loop. They don't know how to handle it. And I partially blame that on their inexperience with non-politicians, but I also blame it on the fact that many of them are acting under the a priori presupposition that Trump is stupid, so they immediately go to that conclusion if there's even the slightest whiff of that in their world, in the reality, in the echo chamber that they've created. Trump said he'll pause his plan to implement tariffs on the EU so that they can all negotiate. Do you think that if Trump didn't impose these tariffs, then the EU would still come to the negotiating table? I'm not thinking so. And at the least, if they did come to the negotiating table, Trump would have far less leverage. So, in all of this, the biggest sigh of relief really comes from the agricultural industry. They still have to be subjected to the effects of the Chinese tariff, but now they don't have to eat the cost of the EU tariffs as well. And it's unfortunate that the vast majority of soybeans are sold to the Asian markets because China was already expected to up their soybean imports. But it's okay for them because they're essentially buying agriculturally rich land through oil for money deals in Venezuela, and they're moving into Australia, even though that's more of a cultural takeover and less about agricultural. But that doesn't mean that it's not still a factor. On another note, Pompeo officially called for Russia to end its annexation of Crimea. He said the United States calls on Russia to respect the principles to which it has long claimed to adhere and to end its occupation of Crimea. But here's a good example of Washington Post showing their bias. Now, that story is from July 3rd, and they cite that Trump said that Crimea is Russian because the majority of people in Crimea speak Russian, and he's right. There's a difference between the nationality of a person, which is always fixed, and the country in which they reside. So there's a difference between describing a culture and describing a physical nation. And it was unclear at the time what exactly Trump meant, even though it's easy to see how WAPO would question it. But now it's clear what he meant. He meant that culturally they're statistically majority Russian, and that's true. But Trump's language either advertently or maybe inadvertently affected how Russia viewed the statement because Putin agreed to talk with Trump. And it also affected the conclusions that the media outlets came to, which exposed their underlying bias, if only in a minor amount. Plus, Trump said at the summit with Putin that they didn't agree on Crimea. So that's a clear indication that they have opposing views on the subject. Putin obviously wants to take control of Crimea. So someone opposed to him would not want Russia to control Crimea. But it looks like the mainstream didn't figure that out when they were busy freaking out over the fact that Trump even talked to Putin. So that's all for this video. Little recap. Trump got the EU to the negotiating table, and all signs point to a similar method being used on China. And Pompeo officially called for Russia to get out of Crimea. And the next summit between Trump and Putin has been pushed off until 2019. So we'll have to keep an eye on what actually comes of the EU negotiations, because there were agreements reached. I mean, it seems it's all just talk at this point. But of course, this gets the relationship into a better state all around, where an agreement can actually be drawn up instead of just being something that's basically a shot in the dark. So thank you all so much for watching. I really appreciate all the support. For those who wish